a former attorney general, a rising senator, a bill no one questioned until she stepped into the room. What Pam Bondi uncovered wasn't just political scandal, it was something far darker. And by the time she finished speaking, Congress wasn't just shaken, it was exposed. It was supposed to be just another routine congressional hearing. The kind where senators drone on, aides scribble into notebooks, and journalists quietly scroll through their phones, half listening. But something about today felt off. The room was unusually full. A few extra cameras, a few too many glances at the door. And then she entered. Pam Bondi. She hadn't set foot in a congressional chamber in years. But she didn't walk in like a guest. She walked in like a storm. Former Attorney General of Florida. Known for her sharp tongue, calculated calm, and surgical dismantling of courtroom lies, Pam had a reputation. She didn't show up unless something was about to break. Today's hearing focused on national security funding. The agenda was dry. A new bill spearheaded by Senator Chris Van Hollen aimed to divert excess surveillance funding toward educational technology. On paper, it sounded good, practical, forward-thinking. But Bondi wasn't buying it. "There's something hidden here," she whispered to a local reporter just before taking her seat. "And I'm not leaving without putting it on record." She wasn't testifying, at least not officially. When she was called forward, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The senator's bill may sound noble," she said, voice crisp, eyes locked on Van Hollen. "But behind this language of education and reform is something else entirely. Something dangerous." A soft murmur rolled across the room. She laid a file on the table. A thick folder, bursting with charts, contracts, and communications. Slowly, methodically, she flipped to the first page. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a signed deal between the Department of Education and a firm called Sentinel Strategies. On record, they're a data analytics company. But that's not all they are." She paused. "They were originally contracted under Homeland Security. Their specialty? Behavioral surveillance, tracking, monitoring, psychological profiling." Heads turned. Eyes widened. Bondi stepped closer to the mic. "And yet now, they're posing as an education firm, receiving millions through this bill." Van Hollen shifted in his seat. "And it gets worse," she added, "because one of Sentinel's advisory board members just happens to be a former campaign manager for Senator Van Hollen himself." The chamber fell still. For one long moment, no one spoke. Then chaos. Van Hollen pushed his mic forward, voice tight. "That's a gross mischaracterization," he snapped. "I've had no active dealings with that firm. Their board is independent." Bondi didn't blink. She pulled out a payment ledger. Highlighted transactions. Re-election cycle contributions. Consulting fees masked as service contracts. $85,000 paid from Sentinel Strategies to a PAC registered in Delaware, she said. Then routed through 2 LLCs and returned as a campaign donation, within days of this bill's drafting. The silence this time wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Electric. A few senators whispered. Others looked visibly uncomfortable. "Now maybe that's coincidence," she said. "Or maybe it's something else. But if there's nothing to hide, why were 3 public records requests from ethics watchdogs denied?" Even Van Hollen had no immediate answer. Reporters scrambled from the room to file early stories. Phones buzzed. Hashtags began forming before the hearing even ended. And Bondi? She just stood there. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," she said. "But if this chamber exists to serve the public, then the public deserves transparency. Because this bill, if passed, could set a precedent where government surveillance is outsourced and hidden behind words like education." Van Hollen tried to regain control. He called her accusations misleading. Politically motivated. Desperate. She slid the folder forward. "If I'm desperate for anything," she said calmly, "it's the truth." Recess was called. Microphones shut off. Staff rushed to the senator's sides. But even as the cameras dimmed, the damage had been done. Pam Bondi hadn't just raised questions. She'd lit a fuse. What would unravel next, in backrooms, in inboxes, and across news headlines, would prove whether this was politics as usual or the beginning of something far bigger. The hearing room buzzed with whispers as Senator Van Hollen leaned into the microphone. His tone was calm, rehearsed, and brimming with polished confidence. He spoke of the future, one where excess national surveillance spending would be redirected to schools in desperate need of modern technology. "We can't protect our nation," he said, "if we don't equip the next generation." It was the kind of statement that sounded bulletproof. Cameras clicked. Heads nodded. But not everyone was convinced. Pam Bondi sat just feet away, flipping slowly through a heavy binder of documents, her expression unreadable. Then her name was called. She stood, unfolded her glasses, and walked to the witness table with the quiet assurance of someone who knew more than she was letting on. She didn't waste time. "Thank you, Chairman. I've reviewed the bill, and while it reads as a noble proposal, what I found beneath its language is deeply troubling." The room stiffened. She held up the first page, a government contract dated only weeks earlier. "This document," she said, "is an agreement between the Department of Education and a firm called Sentinel Strategies. But here's the problem. Sentinel isn't an education company." The room leaned in. "They're a behavioral analytics firm previously contracted under Homeland Security. Their background is surveillance, psychological profiling, digital movement tracking, not educational reform." Gasps. One senator narrowed their eyes. Another began furiously jotting notes. "And yet," Bondi continued, "this firm stands to gain $16.4 million under Senator Van Hollen's reallocation plan." Her words were deliberate, measured, explosive. Senator Van Hollen interrupted, trying to take back control. "That contract was awarded independently. There's no direct connection between myself and Sentinel Strategies." Bondi didn't even look up. She simply flipped the next page. "This is an internal email thread, dated 3 months ago, between Sentinel executives and a third-party lobbying group, one previously employed by your campaign, Senator." The silence cracked into quiet murmurs. She continued. "They discussed early drafts of this bill before it was introduced on the floor." That was the first real shift in the room. Journalists began texting under the table. Staffers whispered behind folders. One aide slipped out quietly with a phone already ringing. Still, Bondi wasn't done. "Let's talk about Crossline Consulting," she said. "A firm that received $85,000 over 2 months from Sentinel." She opened a new folder. "Crossline is a shell. It has no staff, no public offices, no verifiable service output. But it does have one connection, a shared financial officer with a PAC that supported Senator Van Hollen's last campaign." This time, a senator audibly said, "What?" Van Hollen leaned back, lips pressed together, but his face was starting to crack. Not panic, but something close. Pam looked up for the first time. "If this was simply about better tech in schools, I'd be on board. But what this looks like is a laundering scheme disguised as educational reform." No one breathed. Then Van Hollen responded, not with facts, but with fury. "This is beneath you, Pam. You're spinning dots into webs." Her reply was ice cold. "I'm reading what's in front of me." Then she dropped the bomb. "One of the encrypted email accounts involved in coordinating these contracts registered to a DC address." She pulled out a printed IP trace. "That address is listed under a staffer in your legislative office, Senator." That was it. The committee chair slammed his gavel, trying to restore order. Senators argued across the aisle. One aide dropped their pen in shock. Journalists stood up to get a better view. And Bondi? She calmly closed the folder and pushed it forward. "This is just the beginning," she said. but it's enough to warrant an immediate ethics inquiry and a freeze on this bill's progression. As chaos unfolded, Van Hollen looked around the room, a man once in control now surrounded by suspicion. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because she knew, once the truth starts unraveling, it rarely stops. The moment Pam Bondi finished speaking, the room fell into an eerie, vibrating silence. The kind of silence that doesn't mean people aren't talking. It means they're all thinking at once, reprocessing what they just heard, and wondering what it might mean for the man sitting 2 seats to her left. Senator Chris Van Hollen sat stiff in his chair, his hands tightly folded, lips thin, eyes locked on the folders now spread out across the table like weapons. He was a seasoned politician. He knew how to take a punch. But what Bondi had just thrown wasn't a jab. It was the beginning of a political earthquake. The committee chair leaned forward, clearing his throat, trying to stabilize the room. "We'll allow the senator to respond." Van Hollen leaned into his mic. "This isn't evidence," he said calmly. "It's innuendo. Cherry-picked documents, ripped from context and framed to humiliate. There is no hidden agenda. There is no scandal." A few nods from his party, but Bondi didn't flinch. Instead, she gently pushed forward another sheet, this time an invoice. "This is a bill for $12,000 paid to Crossline Consulting just 1 week after Sentinel was greenlit. No work performed, no deliverables, no explanation." A murmur rippled through the room like static. "I've reviewed over 20 such payments," she continued, "all structured the same way, small enough to fly under radar. But together, they represent over $400,000. Now it wasn't just reporters reacting. Senators leaned forward. Staffers stopped whispering and started typing. Van Hollen stiffened. "I don't sign invoices," he said. "That's handled by campaign finance teams." Bondi cut him off gently but with precision. "And yet, every one of these companies shares a registered business agent, one who previously served as your campaign treasurer." Another shockwave. More flashbulbs. "And if there's nothing wrong here," she added, "why has every Freedom of Information request tied to this bill been stalled, redirected, or denied in the last 90 days? No answer. What had started as a funding hearing was now unraveling into a full-blown public inquisition, and the epicenter was shifting from the bill itself to the man who had authored it. Someone from the press gallery shouted, "Senator, did you know about the money trail?" Security moved in. The chair slammed his gavel again. "Order in the chamber." But the order was gone. The hearing had become a firestorm. Cameras that had been pointed toward the podium were now locked on Van Hollen. Photographers stood up, angling to capture his reaction, the fidgeting fingers, the tight jawline, the brief flicker of panic in his eyes. One senator turned to a colleague and whispered, "She came with proof. She didn't guess her way here." And then came the final blow of the hour. Pam slid forward one last sheet of paper, an email, partially redacted but time-stamped. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't from her office. It was an internal communication between 2 committee staffers, one of whom worked directly under Van Hollen. The subject line? "Push this quietly. Bondi doesn't have access to Sentinel docs. Yet." Silence again, but this time not hollow. This time it was fear. Someone had tried to keep her out. Someone on the inside knew what was coming, and had hoped she wouldn't connect the dots in time. But she had, and she'd brought it all into the light. Van Hollen adjusted his jacket and leaned back. For the first time, he didn't speak. The committee chair looked down at the papers, then out across the room. "This matter will be formally reviewed. Until then, this hearing is in recess." Gavel down. Panic up. Reporters poured out of the room like water through a dam. Headlines were already being written in real time. Staffers for multiple senators began shredding side notes and dialing private lines. And at the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, still composed, still calm, but unmistakably the reason the storm had arrived. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. Because she didn't need to. She had just ripped the curtain off something far more powerful than a policy disagreement. She had exposed a network, a plan, a possible cover-up, and she had done it with paper, silence, and truth. As the hearing room emptied, the echo of Bondi's revelations still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Outside the Capitol, the media frenzy had already begun. News vans lined the curbs. Flashing red banners flooded television screens. Van Hollen faces ethics firestorm. Bondi drops bombshell at security hearing. But inside Van Hollen's private office, panic had arrived in silence. He paced behind closed doors, surrounded by a handful of advisors, their faces pale and their voices low. The evidence Bondi had presented couldn't be dismissed with soundbites anymore. It was real. It had legs. And the public, they were watching. Across town, Bondi was already one step ahead. She wasn't giving interviews. She wasn't celebrating. Instead, she sat alone in a quiet federal office, submitting a formal complaint to the Senate Ethics Committee, complete with files, supporting emails, financial logs, and whistleblower testimony. She knew this wasn't over. In fact, she was sure it had only just begun. That evening, a new detail surfaced, one even Bondi hadn't revealed during the hearing. A leaked memo from Sentinel Strategies. The memo outlined their intent to integrate behavioral prediction models into K-12 public school systems, funded directly through the reallocation bill. Not just supplying tech, monitoring behavior, emotions, even political leanings of students under the guise of learning assistance. The internet lit up. Parents, teachers, civil liberties groups, they exploded into action. Petitions were launched. Social media boiled over with hashtags like #Datagate, #ProtectOurKids, and #BanSentinel. And in the middle of the storm, Senator Van Hollen said nothing. He canceled 2 public events, refused interviews. His staff issued a cold 2-line statement. The senator stands by the transparency of his work and welcomes any formal review. But the silence only made it worse. A day later, an anonymous whistleblower, confirmed to be a junior staffer on Van Hollen's education committee, came forward on a major news outlet. With their voice distorted and identity hidden, the staffer said, "There were directives to fast-track the contract approvals. We were told not to copy certain memos via email." Everything felt off. The interviewer leaned in. Did Senator Van Hollen know? A pause. He wasn't just aware, the staffer said. He approved it. The country snapped to attention. Major newspapers called for an independent investigation. A bipartisan group of senators, including some who'd once supported the bill, demanded a formal audit. And yet, Bondi still hadn't spoken again. Until that Friday night. She appeared on a nationally televised news special. Calm. Focused. Not angry, but deeply, visibly concerned. "This isn't about me or one senator," she said. "It's about power being used in the shadows. This bill was sold as progress, but underneath it was something far more dangerous. A system built to watch, record, and manipulate. Our children were the test subjects." The host leaned in. "Do you believe this was intentional?" Her reply was chilling. "I believe it was strategic. And I believe we haven't seen the last of it." In just 5 days, Bondi had gone from forgotten former prosecutor to national lightning rod, sparking debate not only about ethics, but about privacy, surveillance, and how far lawmakers would go to blur the lines between policy and profit. Behind the scenes, allies of Van Hollen scrambled to clean up the mess. Old interviews were scrubbed. PAC donation logs were updated. One consulting firm even took down its website overnight. But the digital footprint was too large. The trail had already been followed. Screenshots, archived PDFs, whistleblowers, public records. Every effort to cover up only fueled suspicion further. And through it all, Pam Bondi didn't waver. She wasn't running for office. She wasn't building a brand. She wasn't selling a book. She was just doing what she had always done, asking the one question most people in power don't want to answer. What are you hiding? Days passed, but the political air hadn't cleared. It thickened. What had started as a quiet policy hearing had erupted into a national reckoning. News cycles couldn't keep up. Online forums buzzed with theories. Talk shows argued hour after hour. What did Van Hollen know? When did he know it? And how deep did the Sentinel connection go? And yet, Van Hollen had said nothing since the initial storm. Until now. On a cool Monday morning, flanked by 3 aides and a carefully selected backdrop of American flags, Senator Chris Van Hollen stepped in front of reporters. His face was composed but tight. He was no longer deflecting, he was on offense. I want to be clear, he began. I have never at any time received compensation, favors, or inside knowledge related to Sentinel strategies or any affiliated entity. Then came the pivot. But what's happening here, he continued, is not an investigation. It's a smear. A coordinated attempt to derail a bill that could modernize our education system for millions of underserved students. And it's being led by someone with a personal, political agenda, Pam Bondi. The words dropped like bricks. Bondi's name, said not with fear, but with fire. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was declaring war. Reporters scrambled to respond. One shouted, "Are you saying she fabricated evidence?" Van Hollen didn't flinch. "I'm saying she is a trained prosecutor. And like any prosecutor, she knows how to present a narrative. She doesn't need to lie. She just needs to lead you into believing what she wants." Then, almost as if rehearsed, his office released its own set of documents. A 62-page file labeled Context Pack. It was designed to counter Bondi's claims, pointing out that some of the shell companies she named were also used by other senators, that some of the emails lacked complete chains, that some of the contracts she presented had been approved by bipartisan panels, not just his office. It wasn't a full defense, but it was just enough to cloud the water. And that was the point. The media split instantly. Some headlines read, "Van Hollen reclaims the narrative." Others warned, "The deflection playbook begins." But behind the scenes, something else was happening. 3 new whistleblowers came forward. This time from inside Sentinel itself. Their anonymous testimony leaked to a major network, exposing a chilling quote from a senior executive. "We don't need to spy on kids. We just need to understand what makes them loyal. The rest will follow." The quote went viral. Bondi, who had remained silent through Van Hollen's press offensive, finally broke her silence. Not on TV. Not in print. She released a 30-second video on social media. Just her. No makeup. No lights. A single camera. Her voice calm but razor sharp. "I'm not interested in political theater," she said. "I'm interested in the truth. And the truth doesn't need to yell." Then the camera zoomed in, revealing she was holding something. A subpoena request, filed with the Senate Committee for a formal, open-door investigation into not just Van Hollen, but the entire contracting process involving Sentinel Strategies, Crossline Consulting, and every shell company that had touched the bill. The post gained 10 million views in 6 hours. And then the unexpected twist. A 4th whistleblower stepped forward. This time not anonymous. A former assistant director of Sentinel, who had left just 2 months ago, appearing on live television. He looked nervous, tired, but ready. "Pam Bondi isn't wrong," he said. "In fact, she doesn't even have the full picture." He reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. "This," he said, "contains contracts, internal meeting notes, recordings. Everything. If you think this is just about education or campaign funds, you're wrong. This was a test program, and it was never meant to stop at schools. The anchor looked stunned. The screen faded to black. By the next morning, Senate leadership had no choice. A full federal probe was opened. Subpoenas were issued. Documents seized. Staff questioned. Sentinel's CEO resigned. Van Hollen? Silent again. But the damage had already escaped the shadows. And Bondi? She wasn't gloating. She wasn't parading in victory. She just issued one sentence in a written statement. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It waits. And in the stillness, the nation listened. So now the question isn't whether Pam Bondi was right. The question is, how much of this was already in motion, and who else was in on it? Because if this one hearing revealed this much, imagine what's still hidden.